It would entail nothing less than the complete ecological conversation of our economies, changing our paradigm and the indicators on which we consequently rely. Humanity would have to be reintegrated into nature and renounce its exploitation for profit. Agriculture, modes of consumption, production, travel, and transport would all require transformation. Welcome to Transformation. Welcome to the Radio Tipping Point. Mike Boyle at the controls. And I'd like to start this show with an event that took place a few weeks ago. This was in the middle of May, actually, called the Post-Growth Conference. And it was a very interesting 3 days. And there were so many side conversations that I felt that at the end of the 3 days, we might be nodding our head in agreement, but what we might be nodding towards or nodding to might be something completely different. So it was important for me to see if I can try to package some of those impressions that I received. And the show is titled Growth, No Growth. And this is the word that we keep coming back to, this idea of growth. And perhaps some of you might have heard the phrase degrowth. In fact, a number of years ago, I held an interview with someone who participated in a degrowth festival. And she went on to talk about a number of the injustices to be found. And you see that association quite often, that we will use such terminology as degrowth, and we will look at it as being the silver bullet to solve all of our problems. But I think before we even move to that quote that I started the show with, that we need to spend some time with this word growth. Because not quite sure whether it has a bad rap. Obviously, the way that it's been used in an economic form has been the root of a number of the evils that we keep talking about. That being said, this idea of growth is actually quite normal. And there was an interesting quote that I came up with recently, specifically tied to the use of the word growth. And the author stated that growth is the innovative persistence of life. And I found that a common thread in a number of the pieces that I've been going through recently that very often comes back to that point. So it's not just me who feels that growth is something quite normal. If you think about it from a nature perspective, in nature things grow, and if they were not to grow, then we would have some serious problems. So the issue isn't necessarily the growth per se, but rather this idea of endless growth. So let's take advantage of the opportunity to try to put this term growth in different perspectives. And so within this journey that I thank you in advance for joining me with, I'd like to look at this concept from different perspectives. And one I'd like to start with is one that I stumbled across a few years ago, and I can't even remember where I stumbled across, because every time I look for it, I have difficulties finding it. But it's based upon scientific research that was performed by Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. And they, to sum up that of what they were working on, it's called the Santiago School of Cognition. And this was a scientific treatise that was put together in the 70s, relatively early 70s, I believe. And when I first ran across this, there are some parts that seem quite normal, but the general concept is actually mind-blowing. It's all tied to knowledge, the association, in my mind, of growth and knowledge, and the claim that Maturana and Varela were making. First of all, before I go into the actual claim, there was a word that they used to describe this process, and it's called autopoiesis. And the word autopoiesis, I had to look it up, so don't feel bad. It infers some sort of self-production. That means that we are able to reproduce ourselves. And that is very much a basic tenet of what I keep finding. But that alone is not the actual claim to fame that Maturana and Varela have for me. They inferred within this cognition that in that process of striving towards self-production and knowing full well that we know more today than we did yesterday, even though we might not necessarily acknowledge that, we might not react to it. But if we allowed ourselves to accept the presence, then we would know that we know more today than we did yesterday. So within this concept, the looking at the development of nature, or it's called the Holocene. Perhaps that might make it a little bit easier. The development was a huge chain of, I'm going to call it trial and error. That means you think you know how to improve on that of what you currently have. You might get it right, or you maybe not quite get it right. And we continue on this path, and we know this as human beings. And the idea is through this cognition theory, or this path towards cognition, that we're aware of things and that we take that knowledge to progress in some fashion, or to persevere, to use one of the words in the quotation. So we continue and we continue, and through that path, the path that we take, it is implied that we are collecting knowledge along the ways. And so within this concept of the cognition theory, if you think about it, the Holocene has been around a lot longer than us, and within the Anthropocene. So if we take all of this at face value, then nature has to be much smarter than we are. And once I came to that revelation, that explained a lot of things to me. That means that in spite of our best efforts in trying to control nature, we understand that that's not possible. We might be able to manage things in a way that allows for us to progress in some fashion, and to a certain degree, you can see that as being part of that cognition path. That being said, we make a general assumption that is not true, and that would be that we are always capable of observing, weighing, or judging, and applying that ultimate knowledge that we cannot have. So we'll start something into motion, and we'll, in that transactional linear way that we think, we look at problem and then the corresponding solution, and then we say, hey, we came up with a solution. The problem is no longer there. And sometimes the problem will appear again, or maybe not, or it will appear much later. But the fact is, as human beings, we haven't been doing that this long. Certainly not in comparison to that huge environment that we have, that we call nature. So first off, we have to get off of our pedestal and stop thinking that we are so much more knowledgeable, because there are certain things that we cannot know. We haven't been around long enough, and furthermore, I believe our arrogance very often gets in the way. So very often when I talk about these subjects and understanding the role of nature, the knowledge of nature, our role within that environment, then I like to start the narrative in explaining the fact that how long have we been on this planet? 5,000 years, perhaps 10,000 years? Not quite sure. In essence, it's irrelevant. The key here is that nature, as we define it, has been around for 3,500,000 years, 4 million years, maybe even longer. So the complication and the intricacies that are to be found within nature, I think one of the big issues we have is the ability to actually comprehend it, because we're just not that far along. And so perhaps maybe the step that I'm really looking for here is the ability to accept that we cannot know what we don't know, because we lack the ability of actually understanding it. And in fact, that's really one of the biggest problems we have. We try to simplify matters and to come back to the subject at hand, that being growth. Thinking in that linear way, then we've built this illusion that we just continue growing, whereas we know that we as human beings do not grow infinitely. We reach a certain period within our growth, and it comes to an end, or perhaps we might be growing in a way that perhaps is not necessarily to our liking or part of our intention. And then there becomes a period of decline. And so we're talking about what we often call is a life cycle, that we begin, we grow, we flourish, we reach our pinnacle as far as the size and perhaps even mental capacity. Knowing full well that as much as I believe in neuroplasticity, there are some limits here. certainly with the number of gray cells that we lose, and then we go into decline. So this idea of infinite growth is an illusion to begin with. And so if we put that idea to the side and understand that it actually is not applicable, then that allows us to think about, well, what does this word growth actually mean? Tying this into the Santiago School of Cognition, then growth would be the ability to thrive in that we know more today than we knew yesterday, and over the great period of time, over decades, over centuries, over millennia, that knowledge, that we're able to tap into that knowledge in whatever form it may be, whether it be something that we would call innate, if you believe that knowledge is also passed on to generations through our DNA. And there are some studies that show that we have all reason to believe that there is a correlation between those experiences that we have, that knowledge that we have, the adjustment that we have, and that without us being very cognitive about what we're doing, we do pass that information on to future generations. And in fact, sometimes the experiences of future generations, they do not know why they react a certain way. They do not know why they come to certain conclusions. They don't understand certain trauma because this is being transmitted in a way that has nothing to do with their here and now. It has nothing to do with their actual physical experience. But it's all tied to this continuum that we call life. And when you think about the subject on this level, then for me, it sounds quite glorious. Very positive. And it means that we have the conditions to thrive. But that's based way too much on a linear way of looking at things. And within this concept of growth, and if we believe that it's progress or the ability to thrive, and understanding that within that cognition, that it's not always an upward trajectory, that there can be some setbacks, and there can be some very serious setbacks. For some strange reason, I keep running across this subject in a way that has caused me truly to ponder what kind of thoughts were taking place at the time all of this was hitting the newsstand. And I'm referring specifically to Charles Darwin, in the way that not only how we interpret Darwinism, and that is the confirmation that science is the end all and be all, but also understanding that journey that took place, and to what degree perhaps some of Darwin's concepts became misconstrued, And if you think about the concepts of evolution, that falls very well into the cognition theory, because we understand that we progress and that we accumulate knowledge, and it might not necessarily just be cognitive, but rather it becomes part of the way that we are built, and that information is passed on in the form of DNA. But we have to understand at the time, this was back in 1838, I believe. 1837? No, 1838. We have to understand that knowledge is always viewed in the context of the, let's call it the zeitgeist, that of what we are to find ourselves in. And so that would have been the Industrial Revolution. I'm just kind of blue skying this one a little bit because I hadn't really thought of it and putting all of this on a timeline, but that can actually be quite useful for us here. So it was we were completely in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. And that meant that we were living in very turbulent times. And I like to think that we say that our time on this planet right now is very turbulent. And then I wouldn't negate it, but I think as far as impact is concerned, it would be much higher in the Industrial Revolution. How would I compare that? The difference is that the pace and perhaps I'm not even sure about the velocity. I think it's primarily the pace. I think the velocity is partially man-made. But in the speed that things are changing and the ability to keep up is really our challenge. Whereas in the Industrial Revolution, it was based upon the actual turbulence to be found within that time. And we have to take into consideration our general thought of knowledge. We were very much a village-based society. Obviously, we had cities, but for the most part, people lived on the countryside. They were involved in agrarian activities. And all of this plays a very important role as to whatever the mindset was of the people at that time. And again, I'm not putting any value judgment, quite the opposite. I think it's very important for us to hold the ability of being able to emulate put ourselves back into that time and try to better understand what their thought process could be. And later on, I'll talk about this idea of continuum, and I think without planning this one, that it actually fits in quite well. So back to Darwin. So Darwin comes up with this idea. He was certainly not completely unique. This was picked up by different threads that were already to be found within our society, conversations that were taking place, thought processes that were already there. But good old Charles Darwin seemed to be the right person, the right time, with the right idea and the right phraseology. And so it wasn't just the cognition through evolution, but in throwing science in our face. And I think that was the key here, the question of science, because there were a lot of things that we believed that were based upon tradition, and it was, which is clearly also a form of cognition, which we seem to negate very easily. And we've seen to what degree that has been a fatal flaw. Because for us, it's always an all or nothing. Because we think everything that we knew beforehand was not valid or no longer valid, and we know so much better. And so basically we're talking about omission through arrogance. That's really what it is. So let's continue. We we're thrown into a situation where science is being smacked into our faces. It's often used as a vehicle by which we said, well, these pagan rituals you have, you can see that it's all gobbledygook, right? Because it's not empirical. We cannot prove it through any type of quantitative method. And because qualitative is a difficult one for us to measure, well, we'll leave that one to the side. And then we hooked onto this phrase, survival of the fittest, right? Survival of the fittest. And we have to remember what kind of discussions were taking place at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. In one particular subject, that being of eugenics, was the kindling of the fire that led us to the destruction that we can all be ashamed of. So Darwin kind of got derailed, and then we came to the conclusion that yes, science is we live in a scientific society, and everything should be proven, and science is the sole vehicle that we have that allows for us to make progress. And please, no hate mail. I'm not disagreeing with this, but my point is, it's not an all or nothing proposition. If we can drop the dualism for a change, that would be very, very nice. And it's not science's fault. It's human beings, the human beings that led us to create this deterministic model that basically allows for us to manage our future. And we negate the past, we manage the future, we find no credence in the actual cognition process. We negate the transmission from generation to generation in a non-oral, non-written, non-historical... don't go down that route. Because all of this can't be proved. Or so we claim, because we lack the ability to perform those measurements in ways that we haven't come up with so far. You have entered the tipping point party on this June day of 2024, and the show is titled Growth, No Growth. And if we believe that there are other ways by which we define this word growth, the personal growth, societal growth, that ability to thrive, then let's see if we can find a way to perhaps ensure that all of that information that is at our disposal, that we're able to utilize it. And with that, I'd like to take us all on a journey a little bit more into the metaphysical component. And here I'd like to work with some of the thoughts that came from one very enlightening person by the name of Joanna Macy. And Joanna Macy is an American who lives in California. I'm not quite sure if I think she's still alive. I haven't heard anything else about that. And Joanna Macy has spent a lot of time in her entire life understanding not just the scientific, but understanding the spiritual, and understanding the ritual, and understanding, I'm going to call them undercurrents. Undercurrents being certain forces that perhaps we're not necessarily cognizant of at first glance, because we do not allow ourselves the time to go down that route, and very possibly I wouldn't be surprised that for some they would prefer not to go down there, simply because of, well, two things. One, you can't control it, and the second one, you might not like what you find out. And we run across that situation quite often, simply because we don't want to admit certain things or acknowledge certain things, and stop putting value on certain things, not to relish in those things, but understand that this is all still part of us. And it's better to acknowledge it and figure out ways to live in that harmony within ourselves, harmony with each other, harmony with all living creatures. Well, Joanna Macy came up with, how would we call this? We would call this description of the current state, the way that we look at things, and another viewpoint. And when I say another viewpoint, it's actually one that's much more innate than we care to realize. It's just that it's one that we've more or less put to the side. We couldn't define it so well. It was not so predictable. And so, being the utilitarians that we are, we didn't find the value. But perhaps in this June day of 2024, we could take advantage collectively of this chance to see if maybe we can find some added value. So what Joanna was talking about is this view that we have, which is called Parmenides, and it's inferring the stuff-based view, in comparison to Heraclitus, which would be a flow-based view. So these are the two models we're talking about: a stuff-based view or a material-based view, or a flow-based view, which doesn't refer to the actual physical components per se, but the actions are taking place. So within this Parmenides, she states the universe is made of stuff, and to understand it, we need to understand matter. To understand more about something, take it apart, see what it's made up of. Objects are in relationship to each other, but it is the objects that are significant in foreground. Oh, there's some points that I'd like to highlight of what she mentioned here, and this is certainly not what she's purporting. She's looking for the flow-based. But within this description, she's inferring that within the stuff-based view, that it's the value that we find is based on a reductive behavior, or that that necessity to break things down into smaller and smaller and smaller entities, because we believe that the inherent value can be broken down to that level. And basically by saying that, we're inferring that there's no relationship between all of these elements. So within the flow-based view, she makes the claim that the universe is made of flows. To understand it, we need to understand how these flows work in systems. Conglomerations of flows from objects, which may also be interesting, but the nature of these can best be understood by looking at the flows they are part of and flows within them. So within this comment, Joanna is talking about holism, the completeness, the full picture, the ability to understand all of the components and the relationship between the components. And understand not necessarily those components within it, within the flow, but the actual flows per se, and what those flows are telling us. And it's implicit that the knowledge that we have is to be based upon that cognition I talked about earlier, where the determination of the flows are based upon that knowledge that we were able to accumulate, and that these flows don't just happen on their own. And because we have difficulty in determining that actual path, I would argue it goes back to the capabilities that we just don't have yet. So to continue on this path, the stuff-based view includes diagrams of objects linked by relationships. And Joanna makes the claim that we should look at the inverse here, where she mentions the idea or the concept of diagram of flows forming objects, so that it's actually the flows per se that create the objects. And that these relationships between objects don't just happen on their own, but rather those relationships, those flows, help in a very strong way in creating the object. And in fact, if you think about it, if you look at it from your own personal perspective, there's a lot of truth to be found within that of what Joanna said. Are we truly these independent entities who define how our relationships are? That we make a conscious decision, those relationships that we want to have and those that are not necessary. Or we might perform those actions. But that does not allow us to thrive. It does not bring value. And unfortunately, it's an illusion. Whereas if we were able to understand and accept those natural flows that we have within our existence, and understand that who we are is very much based upon those touch points that we've had within our lives that we did not control. We did not control them. We could not predict that those conversations, those meetings, those altercations, those moments of understanding, we could not control it. We cannot predict it. But we know that it's played a very important role in forming us as human beings, right? So let's move on. Power over. Bigger objects can influence smaller objects within the stuff-based view. And just to be clear, this stuff-based view is the claim that Joanna is making, that this mindset is the one that is predominant within our society today. And within this flow-based view, she sees it as power with. If one element in a flow is doing well, so will the next. Oh, there's so many thoughts that come to mind that tie into that particular statement, apart from the idea that this concept of a zero-sum game is not tenable. It does not allow us to thrive. It might be based upon the illusion of one's growth on an individual and very selfish or narcissistic way. But it's not tenable. It's not tenable. And what Joanna is telling us here is that our growth, aka the ability for us to thrive, is very much tied to this ability to go with the flow, right? We go with the flow. We don't fight the flow. And I have another example. This is coming out of system thinking, concept that I firmly believe in. And this concept is called leverage points. And within this idea of leverage points, the intention is to identify those small things that bring a big impact. Because, of course, as human beings, we've been conditioned to think that bigger is better, complicated is better, instead of understanding that it's those small things with small adjustments that allow for us to have a big impact. And this concept of leverage points is clearly in alignment with what Joanna is talking about when she talks about flow. Win-lose. With a finite amount of stuff, the more I have, the less is available for you. So we're back to zero-sum game tied to the stuff-based view. So what would be the opposite within what would be not necessarily the opposite, because that would be another dualistic way of looking at things, but what would be a possible alternative within the flow-based view? Win-win and lose-lose. If there are large amounts of flow, everyone does well. If the flow reduces, everyone does worse. Ooh. So what's she telling us here? She's telling us that our fate is very much tied to each other. And when I say each other, I'm not necessarily just referring to the human beings. And we see this one's quite clear today in understanding that our relationship to nature, and there we clearly believe in this zero-sum game, that it's the minerals are there for the taking. The environment is for exploitation. Because if we don't do it, then somebody else will. And that also applies to the relationship that we have to each other. And if we believe that it's transactional, if we believe it's zero-sum, then we're never going to understand this particular point that Joanna's raising to us here, that our fate is tied to each other. And the sooner we understand that we need to create environments for everyone to thrive, unless we're able to do that, then we shouldn't be surprised that we end up in a situation where it almost seems like it's a downward spiral. And this reminds me of a book that I'm actually reading today. I'm just to show how emergent these shows are. And I wrote it down because I thought I was going to screw up the name. And based on the precedence in the show, there would have been a clear bullseye. So the name of the author is Peter Kropotkin, and the book is called Mutual Aid. And this book was written in 1902. And the actual copy that I'm reading right now is 1914 edition, the beginning of the First World War. And he's a Russian who was living in the UK, and he writes about the development within the Holocene and within that of what we call nature, and that is very much based on trying to create a win-win environment. Obviously, Kropotkin didn't use the phrase win-win. That's very much a late 20th, early 21st century creation. But he refers to it as being mutual aid. Mutual aid meaning that we figure out ways to support each other, knowing full well that it is the only true solution for us to move forward. And for me, using this word growth, it's the only way for us collectively to thrive, because we cannot thrive individually. And that was the main point of what Kropotkin's been talking about. And I think it's quite demonstrative in that of what Joanna was saying with this idea of win-win, lose-lose. So let's move on. The stuff-based view from Joanna states that independence, my relationships are optional and exist through me. So what could be an alternate view to that? Interdependence, I exist through my relationships. And of course that makes perfect sense when you think that those relationships are based upon those flows that we do not control. We pretend to control them, but we don't control them. Within that striving towards efficiency, we keep thinking, well, this is the answer we're looking for, so how do we create conditions that will allow us to make this one happen? A few more points from Joanna. The total amount of stuff is limited. And it all depends on whether we're talking about something positive or negative, whether we're making a differentiation here. But Joanna goes on to say that unlimited amount of flow, you can keep increasing flows in existing systems and create new systems with new flows without having to create more stuff. Ooh, that sounds like a good solution for us, doesn't it? And to close the loop on this idea of post-growth, if you think about this description I gave you in the beginning, that here, let me just go ahead and quote it again. It would entail nothing less than the complete ecological conversion of our economies, changing our paradigm and the indicators of which we consequently rely. Humanity will have to be reintegrated into nature and renounce its exploitation for profit. Now, I couldn't have predicted this one because I just came up with this quote a few minutes prior to the show. But this is really what Joanna's talking about, right? With flow, this is precisely the point, that we are able to work in unison, and that means that we will not be basing this on stuff. We will be basing it on creating new flows that of interdependency, flows of interdependencies between peoples and people with the Holocene, knowing full well that our only real solution is based upon something that is no longer stuff-based, but it's flow-based. Isn't that beautiful? Well, I couldn't have predicted that one. And the last quote from Joanna, let me see if I can get this one in prior to the closing of the show. Competition for scarce resources, our economic model. And the alternate that Joanna offers us is cooperation produces abundance for everyone. And I'd like to close the show in perhaps talking about a bit of a problem I have with this phrase degrowth. Degrowth is a negative term that infers that we go back in time. It goes back to something that where we would have less thriving if we look at that as being growth. I understand the intention of why this word is used. We want to live within, let's call them planetary boundaries, which of course makes perfect sense, that we would live with less, which also makes perfect sense. But the problem of such phraseology, it doesn't really give us the solution. Sorry, scratch that word solution. It doesn't give us a perspective, because we need to come up with our own solutions, and that means individually and collectively. But it doesn't give us that perspective for us to thrive, to have real growth based upon the concept that we found within the Santiago Cognition theory and that knowledge that we pass on from generations to generations, and this is only something that we learn from nature. Understanding that it wasn't always the way it is today, and that we can come up with true insights if we allow ourselves to explore those things that are actually very much innate within us, either through customs, through different ways that we did things, that we change our focus and remove ourselves from this dependence on our identity being tied to stuff, and that our identity is actually tied to each other, and it is directly related to those flows that we participate in, those flows that we create, and the realization that the true solution is to be found within those environments that we create where we allow for everybody to thrive, which would be the win-win that Joanna talks about, knowing full well that the alternative would be lose-lose, right? The alternative would be lose-lose. So we know exactly what our choices are. So the real constraint is the ability to let things be. And I mean that in an accepting way, and not to accept the current environment that we have, but knowing full well that the only way for us to make progress is to perform that paradigm shift within our own minds that ensures that we are able to put our focus on the right place, right? We put our focus on the right place, having enough faith in ourselves and having enough faith in each other, and having enough faith in that path that the Holocene has been following for almost 4 million years. And let's admit, finally, that nature knows much more than we could ever know. And so what I would wish for you is a way to find that path to the acceptance, so that we can really get to that state of where we create that win-win, and we create that environment so that everybody can thrive. And that would be my wish for all of you this week. And I did it. Another 57 minutes. Cross it off my bucket list. So I'd like to thank you for allowing me to indulge in this solo studio time. Wish you a pleasant week, and I will be back next week, and I will be talking about the events that we'll have next Sunday, and I will be performing what I'm going to call right now a post-mortem. And with that, I say goodbye.